Kia ora, good afternoon. I'm Tim Henshaw, Head of Agribusiness at Westpac, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this Westpac Smarts webinar. Today we are traversing the topics of climate change and on-farm emissions. Climate change is a huge topic for agriculture. There isn't a sector more dependent on the climate within which we raise our animals and crops and produce our wonderful food and fibre. The climate is changing, and we need to make sure we're doing what we can to ensure our farms and orchards adapt so they are resilient to the impacts of climate change and ready to take the opportunities that present, so New Zealand agriculture sector can thrive for centuries to come. Within that picture, we also need to be aware of the externalities created by the sector and the impact on the climate, including accounting for 50% of New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions. With the impending price on these emissions and a rising tide of expectation from customers and from the stakeholders managing the supply chains to our customers, it is strongly in our interest to manage and lower our emissions. So today, I'm really pleased to be joined by a panel of experts from across the sector to really dive into these topics and answer your questions. Today's session is scheduled to run for 45 minutes. The first 30 minutes will be a discussion with the panel, leaving time for Q&A at the end. There will be a Q&A running live on the right of your screen, so register your questions as they come to mind, and please indicate the panelists you'd like it directed to. And if you see a question raised by someone that you like, click on it to increase its rating, and we'll work our way through the highest rated questions first. So let's start off with some introductions. Panelists, I'll ask each of you to give a brief intro and share your background, starting with Professor Anita Wreford.
Kia ora, thanks Tim. So I'm Anita Wreford. I'm a professor at the AERU at Lincoln University. That's the Agribusiness and Economics Research Unit. Most of my work is around adapting to the impacts of climate change, so how we can cope and adjust our systems as the climate is changing. I have an economics and a social science background, so I work together with modelers and people from other disciplines to kind of look at what climate change might mean and how we can, how much it might cost us to change our systems and questions like that. And I come from a sheep farm in South Canterbury, so I have a little bit of a first-hand experience of what agriculture is going through. Thanks.
Step on that, Anita. Thank you. Over to Joe Sheridan.
Hi there, Tim. I've been involved in the dairy industry for about 20 odd years now in various roles, but it's been a real privilege for the last 4 years to be the demonstration manager at our farm. So our farm is a 140 hectare dairy farm nestled along the Waikato River and alongside the St Peter's School campus near Cambridge. We milk about 350 dairy cows there. And in about 2015, a joint venture was formed between St Peter's and Lincoln University, which effectively created the strategy that it is my role to work with the partners and to implement that on farm. So our aim really is to implement best practice in farm performance in an effort to create a sustainable future. And greenhouse gas mitigation and climate change adaptation has been a big part of our journey over the last few years. And hopefully we can share some of that with everyone today.
Brilliant. Thanks, Joe. And over to our last panellist, Phil Journeaux.
Hi, everyone. I'm an agricultural economist based in the Waikato. I've been involved in the agricultural sector for quite a long time now. But over the last 9 years, I've done quite a lot of work with the Greenhouse Gas Research Centre, looking at on-farm mitigations and offsetting, that sort of thing, what farmers can do, what are the implications with respect to greenhouse gas emissions and farm profitability. Also done quite a bit of work with MPI and Iwaka Economist around pricing impacts, sequestration, all that sort of stuff, so which we'll touch on shortly. Thanks, Tim.
Brilliant. Thank you, Phil. So I want to start with Anita. The Westpac New Zealand Agribusiness Climate Change Report brought together all known research on the impacts of climate change on New Zealand agriculture. It assessed the risks and opportunities presented by climate change, and unfortunately we've seen all firsthand the cyclone and flooding risks coming to pass across the country recently. But Anita, what were the other big risks, and also what were the big opportunities highlighted in this report?
Right. Yes. Well, I mean, it's good that you mentioned flooding, because I think in terms of what we're starting to see in the short term are these extremes. So as well as flooding, we can expect, and we are already experiencing, more droughts. And sometimes we're seeing these in places that haven't had them or haven't been used to them in the past. We're also starting to see and can expect to see more droughts occurring in successive years, so 2 or 3 years of drought, which is what really then becomes very difficult for farmers to manage. And some of the work we did for Westpac shows that in terms of their profits. But we also might see more frequent droughts. And so in a 10-year period, when we might used to have had 1 or 2, we might be experiencing 3 or 4. And then they might be followed by a flood or something like that. So those extremes are something that we're starting to experience and we can expect to see more of. Also things like higher temperatures. So some farmers that we've spoken to are already experiencing the impacts of heat stress on their production from their dairy cattle. So that's an area that I think some parts of the country will be watching. We're also starting to see changes in seasonality. So farmers are already talking about noticing changes in when seasons change and how that's affecting their system. So they are already adjusting what they do in some cases. We will also expect to see a changing suitability for what we grow around the country. And so our regions have adapted really to a stable climate, and then we've got some specialisation around that in some areas. And this is likely to change, so that might mean shifting around the country what we do. And this might also present some opportunities. So we're lucky in a way that we have a long, narrow country with different kind of climates throughout it. So there's an opportunity to move some of our production and try different things that we haven't been able to grow in the past in some areas. There might also be some opportunities in pasture growth. Some of the modelling is indicating in some regions for some seasons there might be improvements in pasture growth, but I think we need to be careful about getting too optimistic about that, because those extremes are probably going to counter some of those positive effects. But those are kind of the main impacts that we can expect to see in the short to medium term anyway.
Okay, thanks, Anita. And keen to jump into adaptations. So on-farm adaptations are important tools to manage risks associated with climate change impacts. What were some of the key adaptation practices you saw in that research, and are they the same across the country?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think farmers are, as I mentioned, farmers are very adaptable, and in New Zealand we've had a history of adapting to a lot of changing conditions, and so farmers of course are not just sitting there and doing nothing. So we're hearing farmers talking about changing the timing of when they, for example, calve in some places in the North Island. A lot of them are trying some new mixes of pasture and mixes of crops as well, and combinations. Some are planting trees for shade and shelter to counteract some of that heat stress that we talked about. Some are even thinking and investing in herd homes and that kind of constructed shelter. So those kind of adaptations are occurring. I think and that's really great. We need to understand though, I guess, how effective they'll be into the future. So while they might help now and probably into the short term, we also need to keep our eye on the medium and the longer term, because the climate might change in ways that we're not expecting. It might be, we might have been having droughts, but it might shift more to then wetter conditions. So we need to be monitoring, I think, what's working now and how that is likely to play out into the future. We can also learn from what other regions in the country are doing. So as I mentioned, we've got different climates already here, so we can transfer some of those coping mechanisms to different locations. But getting to your question about if they're different, because the impacts are different, and then also the local conditions are very different in each region. There's different kind of soils and topography, systems have evolved differently, and also farmers' goals and their own personal circumstances will all affect how they adapt. So it is really locally specific, but there are still a lot of lessons we can learn by sharing knowledge and thinking ahead.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point that this needs to be an ongoing conversation, because what will be required further into the future may be different than what's required or available today. What to throw to Joe here, you're applying some of these adaptations on farm, so I'm really interested, and I'm sure the audience will be, of what's worked well for you in our farm, Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And probably just to reiterate a lot of the points that Anita made, is that the climate change impacts each region and each farm system quite differently. And while we're seeing some general trends or a direction of travel for these changes, we continue to experience quite a lot of variance in how that plays out. Some examples are we're roughly a 1,040 millimetre rainfall farm, and yet this year we've had 1,600 millimetres. And so that proportion has sort of been repeated kind of all around the country. So, and this is the risk that climate change brings to our farm business. So our focus really has been on the monitoring the data that allows us to create a little bit of flexibility on how we manage the risk and make informed management decisions. So, two really good examples that Anita touched on was what's happening beneath the soil. So having soil moisture probes measuring at every 100 millimetres what's happening with both temperature and soil moisture. And the other one is our temperature and humidity data. So I'll just quickly touch on those two about what we're doing on farm with them. So, the soil temperature is a really interesting one. Like our soil temperature has increased by 2 degrees up to about 17.6 over the last few years. And the moisture levels, even though our average moisture levels have stayed relatively steady, what we're seeing is that big variance. So we'll go from one year with a 40 millimetre deficit to like this year where it's, we've pretty much been at field capacity all year round. So what we're seeing is the extremes in how those averages are starting to play out. We're also seeing with the soil data, our temperatures are reaching about 18 degrees a lot quicker or a lot earlier in the season than we normally would. So we reached that in about October, whereas normally we'd reach that by about mid-November. And our soils are staying at 18 degrees or even warmer right through to about April, which typically we'd see them start to decrease early in March. So, at the moment, the soil temperature is about 12 degrees and we're growing 40-odd kilos in the Waikato, which normally would be cold and getting frosty and slowing down. So how we're adjusting to that is we're looking at our pasture composition, and we are actively including more species that enjoy the warmer soil type. So, we always put 2 white clovers and 1 red clover. We have plantain added to all our mixes. We also add coxfit to our lighter soils that have the ability to manage with potentially the dry and the warmer soil conditions, particularly under our sandy soil profile that we've got here. And this is in an effort to alleviate the feed supply when ryegrass becomes a little bit stressed either by moisture or soil temperature. And we also have about 7% of our farm each year which is put into summer brassicas, and that allows us to grow feed at a time, transfer it to a time where moisture might limit, the growth of other forages. The second one that Anita also talked around was the temperature and humidity. That's another thing that we're actually measuring on farm as well. And what we're seeing is small increases in air temperature, but increases in humidity coupled with an increase in soil temperature. And you think about our cows standing on, sitting on, lying on ground all day, that effectively is creating quite an increase in their thermal heat loading. So like many farmers, the mitigation strategies come as no surprise. We increase the availability of water. So that's both the access and the quantity of it. We're reducing or changing our milking frequency. We use sprinklers to help cool our cows. We look for low dry matter forage that help to reduce the heat loading on cows where they're having to eat high dry matter feed during the summer period. So those summer brassicas are handy then. We offer shade through our grazing plan, and just this last winter we also planted another 88 shade trees, which is really strategically about trying to future-proof our farm as we start to see these trends increase. The other key part of that is also focusing on high BW cows, and the reason why this is really important when we're managing it is that currently we're top 3% I think nationally, but it will give us options when we need to start selecting for heat tolerant genetics for our herd, and it just means when they're proven viable we can start to select on other traits, but also make sure that we're not having a huge impact on our production efficiency.
Brilliant. Thanks, Joe. Some really great practical things to be doing on farm. Okay, Phil, let's bring you in here, and coming back to the mission side of things. Our agri customers are worried about this, but in a lot of cases they might have a clear view of the impact. You've done the modelling for us on greenhouse gas mitigation options and associated financial impact on those farming businesses, and you've covered Southland Dairy, Waikato Dairy, Canterbury Irrigated Dairy, North Island Hill Country and South Island Intensive Finishing. What are the impacts you see from your modelling for the different farm types?
Well, just to start off, I think going back to first principles, there's three key things that drive greenhouse gas emissions at a farm level. The first, and the biggest by far, is the amount of dry matter eaten. Second is the level of protein in the diet, which is a driver of nitrous oxide. And the third is nitrogen fertiliser, in the sense that we use nitrogen fertiliser to grow more dry matter. So you go back to point one. So in terms of a lot of the modelling work that we've been doing, particularly on the case study farms, etc., is how you manipulate those sort of things, or, well, in essence, reduce them, to reduce your greenhouse gas, but still maintain the financial viability of the farm. And in terms of reducing dry matter, reducing the amount of dry matter eaten by the individual animal is a seriously dumb thing to do. So you're really looking at stocking rate. So in terms of one of the key things we've looked at across both all the farm types is reducing our stocking rate to reduce dry matter eaten, but increasing the productivity of the remaining animals in order to maintain the financial viability of the farm. And you can play around with it. 10% reduction in stocking rate, increase productivity. We've been getting in the order of, say, around 5 to 8% reduction in greenhouse gases, while maintaining, if not improving, the profitability of the farm system. Now, it varies a lot on the individual property. Certainly, if we've reduced stocking rates up by, let's say, 10 to 15%, it becomes very difficult to improve your productivity to the point where you can, pull the financials back to the base farm level. The other point I'd make around that sort of scenario is that if you're already operating at a very efficient level, your ability to reduce stocking rate, improve productivity is significantly reduced. So it's a bit of a conundrum in that area. Certainly on the dairy farms, we've looked at pulling out sort of exogenous inputs such as supplement and nitrogen fertiliser, which again, reduces the amount of dry matter being consumed within the system. And by doing that, we certainly reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, anything from sort of 5 through to 15%. By doing so, we also have a negative impact on farm profitability. The scale of that depends how much the farm is relying on supplement and or nitrogen fertiliser. So, the greater amount of inputs you're putting in, and if you start pulling them out, the greater the impact. For the sheep and beef farms, we've played around looking at changing stock types. So, for example, taking out, say, breeding cows, big animal, low productivity, replacing them with something that's much more efficient, like bulls or finishing steers, that sort of thing. And that throws up a very important issue in the sense that it's actually stocking rate, which is crucial, not stock type. Okay, in the sense that, a stock unit's an animal that eats 6,000 megajoules of EME a year. So it doesn't matter what sort of stock units you've got, they're still going to eat basically the same. So if you replace say a low productive animal with a much more efficient one, all things being equal, you'll certainly improve the financial performance of the farm. But if you just simply maintain the same stocking rate, all things being equal, you have no real impact on your greenhouse gas. But again, in saying that, if you look at, say, going from cows to Friesian bulls, you can reduce your stocking rate with your Friesian bulls because they're so much more profitable. So you'll still make more money. If you reduce your stocking rate, you'll pull your greenhouse gas emissions down. So there's those sort of options there. Other things we've looked at it, particularly in the hill country farms, is reducing ewe numbers and increasing our lambing percent, often significantly. So we'll drop our ewe numbers, say 20%, increase lambing from 130 to 160%. And you get a win-win. You will reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, and you will improve the profitability of the farm. In a general sense, playing around with the farm systems, we've achieved, say, a 5 to 10% reduction in greenhouse gas while maintaining the profitability of the farm. But in saying that, there's a lot of variability between the different farms and that sort of thing. The other thing, Tim, which is crucial when you're talking about doing all this wonderful modelling, is you actually have to translate what modelling means back to the real farm. So, a couple of issues there. Talking about reducing your stocking rate, if you do that, your grazing management becomes absolutely crucial, because it's harder to maintain pasture quality under a low stocking rate. And if you lose pasture quality, your production will crash and burn. And I think a number of farmers who've gone down that route have found, had a fairly harsh lesson in that respect. The other one, in terms of changing your farm systems, again, you need to think through of the farm management implications of that. And if I could use my reduce ewe numbers, increase lambing percent option, there's a whole range of things you need to consider. First, do the animals have the genetic merit to increase their productivity? Your replacement animals have to meet their target live weights. Your ewes have to be well fed at tupping. They have to be absolutely well fed at lambing, because you've got a lot of little multiples running around. When the lambs are weaned, you absolutely have to feed them good tucker to get them up to killable weights. Otherwise, you end up with a lot of little store lambs. So there's a whole range of farm management issues that you need to think through and the implications of them. And in many respects, a lot of that will take several years. All the stuff that we've looked at, there's no real overnight, you're going to go from A to B and save the world in one hit. It takes time to do so. Thanks.
Thanks, Phil. Some great insights there, and I think it's probably worth throwing back to Joe here for sort of the on-farm experience. And Joe, that maintaining pasture quality is often cited as a real challenge to lower stocking rates. So I'm interested in how you guys have managed that at our farm and how your experience has been on the emissions side as a result of that.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I guess echoing a little bit what Phil had mentioned, our journey with our partners over the last 6 years has been sort of a net reduction in greenhouse gases of about 12% and about 9 of nitrous oxide and about 6.7 of methane. So we've done that journey by reducing our stocking rate by about 0.15 of a cow per hectare, so heading down to 2.8 cows per hectare. And we also reduced our imported feed by about 1.5 tonnes per hectare. The main focus through this journey has been on improving pasture quality. So we invested quite a lot on improving the forage species that we had, a lot of renovation via direct drilling, of course, and we also reduced our nitrogen use by about an average of 20 kilos a hectare down to about 130 kilos a hectare. So with that, we've had no real net change in pasture and crop harvested, but we are continuing to achieve around 400 to 440 kilos of milk solids per cow with less total feed within our system. So by focusing on using technologies like sex semen, we've accelerated our BW gains, and we've been able to capture the real value of a higher feed conversion efficiency within our system. So we're really looking at the kilos of dry matter that we're eating relative to the kilos of milk solids that we're producing and making sure we're measuring and monitoring that. So we use the AgFirst Dairy Systems Monitoring Group to analyse that. At the moment, we're sitting at about 13.2 kilograms of dry matter per kilo of milk solid produced, and that I think is about the second lowest in that group out of 25 at the moment. So while we wait for technology interventions like rumen modifiers and methane inhibitors and that to come onto the market, our methane emissions are directly related to the amount of feed that we're consuming on farm. And so what we have to do is extract more value from every kilo of dry matter that we eat. And that is really the core root of any efficient production system. You minimise the wastage and you maximise the output from any given input. So it is farming 101, but there's some tweaks around how you implement it as you start to look at these changes. Now, the second part of your question, Tim, a little bit about the pasture side of it, it's a really interesting one because there's always more to be gained. So 90% of our feed supply is coming from the feed that we're growing on farm. So it makes sense that we proportion our time to managing that properly. So every week we're managing the paddock performance. We use a technology to give us a live daily feed inventory. So every staff member knows on any given day what's on the feed inventory that's on farm and what's happening on any given paddock. When we started to explore some of the barriers to more effective pasture management with a lower stocking rate, we could see that time starts to limit the ability to have flexibility and where you set up a break fence. So, every time you have a grazing event, you're looking at what's happening in the residuals, you're using that feedback to then set up the next break. Having to take down a fence and put it up, all those sorts of things become a little bit time limiting. And also the accuracy of feed allocation. There's lots of technology that are actually enabling our teams to be able to do that better and overcome some of that time barrier. The other thing is also making sure we're very careful around the damage that we're doing to pastures under our systems. So the ability to set up break fences really nice and easily, moving cows from multiple different paddock entrances and all those sorts of things are all part of the solution around getting more out of the pastures that we've got and managing under a lower stocking rate. So I guess the key thing is that it does require more investment, either in people time, people skill, or technology. And our farmers have to be prepared to invest in that in order to carry on moving forward.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jo. Just want to do a quick fire question to the whole panel. There's been some great insights from this discussion, but reinventing the wheel wasn't an efficient way for people to tackle problems. So I'm interested in what advice you would give to farmers and growers around looking for resources that are going to help them in their journey to make their farm more resilient or mitigate their emissions.
Where do you want to start, Tim?
You go, Jo.
Oh, look, from our perspective, we're on a journey, Tim, and I think we're still learning and we're still trying to implement best practice as it becomes proven by our industry bodies. I guess we've got to maintain that mantra of progress before perfection because there's still a lot of unknown about what the future will hold. But what's really important is that we limber up our businesses and we make sure that they are ready and resilient and able to cope with some of the change. So from our farm's perspective, I guess we try and share as much of our journey as possible via our websites and our weekly updates that people can subscribe to, just to share the learnings and where we're accessing all of our information and research from in order to implement it on farm. That's from our perspective there, Tim.
Okay. Thank you, Jo. Anita, Phil, anything to add of where people should go to?
I would just, say that I think I've worked a little bit with our farm, and I think those demonstration farms are a fantastic way for other farmers to see on the ground what might work and what other farmers are trialling. But I guess just from my perspective as an academic in a research organisation, we are also working hard to try and understand, a range of things that can inform what the demonstration farms and the industry groups can then give out to farmers. So I think it's sort of a chain and a two-way exchange of knowledge between research, industry, policy and demonstration farms and farmers themselves.
Brilliant. Thanks, Anita.
And if I could comment, Tim, I think it's probably at this point in time, it's a matter of the farmer getting out and seeking information. I mean, there is stuff out there, in terms of the sort of work that Jo's been doing on our farm. There's some farmlet trials in Taranaki and Northland on dairy units. Very interesting results there. Certainly, in terms of the work that we've been doing, just to comment to attendees, the modelling we've done for Westpac, that report will be available shortly on the Westpac website. There's also a website called Ag Matters, which is run by the Greenhouse Gas Centre. There's a lot of information on that in terms of the case study work that we've been doing. There's some very good videos on there of farmers doing good stuff, all that sort of thing. Coming back to my key point really is there is some information out there. You need to get out and find it. Yeah,
fantastic. And one more quickish fire question for the group. A quick view on you from each on how achievable the proposed emission targets are, and particularly the reduction by 10% by 2030. Maybe we start with Anita.
Oh, gosh. I mean, this is a little bit outside my direct area of expertise, but from what I understand, like for the sector as a whole, 10% is probably realistic. And as the other speakers have said, we are seeing examples at modelling, but actual on-farm examples of getting close to that. I think if we're thinking beyond that, we probably will need to see some changes in our systems, and this is in conjunction with the impacts that I talked about earlier. There are a lot of different pressures on farms, so I think we might need to, or we probably will see some changes in land use, both to achieve emissions reduction, but also those other challenges.
Great, thanks, Anita. Phil.
Well, I think the short answer, Tim, is yes. I think that the sector will achieve the 10% reduction. In saying that, I think it's it's a bit complicated at the on-farm level. I think farmers will make some progress towards it. I'm not sure that many will achieve a 10% reduction, but at the sector level, there are changes, as Anita mentioned. There's a lot of pressures on farming at the moment, and I think both the sheep and beef and the dairy sector will shrink somewhat, driven by things like the freshwater regulations and carbon farming on hill country. So there's a whole combination, if you like. But yes, I think the 10% is achievable.
Great, thanks, Phil. And finally, Jo.
Yeah, Tim, I think just if we are focusing on wastage and production efficiency within our farm businesses, it's going to be a win-win for both the environment and for what we're trying to achieve in this area, and will allow us to step closer to achieving that 10% reduction. I think the big challenge and what we're seeing is maintaining it. So when the climate continues to change around us as we move forward, we've got to be pretty resilient, and we've got to be able to evolve our response to making those gains. So if we end up in a season where we become inefficient at converting that feed into product, that effectively creates more wastage within our system and effectively more environmental footprint. So the big thing is that we've got to work in tandem. So as we're implementing these climate change mitigation, or these greenhouse gas emissions reductions within our farm business, we also have to be moving our approach or working towards adaptation to the changing climate. Because what an efficient farm system looks like under 1,000 millimetres of rainfall is quite different from what an efficient farm system looks like under 2,000 millimetres of rainfall. So that's the type of resilience that we've got to start building into our farm systems.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, guys. So that concludes the panel discussion. So thank you, Anita, Jo and Phil, for your input and insights, some great ideas and insights for us to think about. So we now will move over to our Q&A from the audience. And Phil, first up, a question: if we manage our emissions well on farm, will we get paid more?
Well, that's a big question, Tim. Well, the way I'd answer it is this, and there was an excellent little study done by Lincoln, by the AERU, looking at consumer perceptions, if you like, to climate change issues and the rest. And the short story there is yes, it's much more, or consumer understanding is increasing markedly in that area, and there's a sort of stated preference, if you like, that they want products that are climate friendly. Now, in saying that, are we going to get a premium in the marketplace? In my opinion, I think there may be some niche markets where we might get more money. In our mainstream markets, I don't think so. But in saying that, what it will mean is that we can remain in the marketplace, which is a pretty crucial position to be.
Yeah, that's right. And that's, I think, the point we made earlier of the expectations of the customer and the people in those supply chains that provide to those customers, the Nestle's, the Danones, yes. They're requiring it on the way through, right?
Yes.
All right, to Jo. Please, could you talk a little more about the outlook for rumen modifiers and methane inhibitors?
I guess our outlook is following where the research is going. So there is quite a bit of research happening in that space. What we're looking for is when it is proven within a New Zealand pastoral-based system. So some of the challenges that we've been exploring already is if we had the ability to be able to give methane inhibitors to the cows, how often would we have to dose and what would that look like? So that's put some real challenges with a pastoral-based system where we're trying to take the cow to the feed. We don't want to be in a position where we have to take the cows into the shed just to give them an additive, or we don't want to have to milk the cows twice a day in order for them to go to the shed to get the additive. So it's good to see. I mean, there's been work done on in paddock feeding machines like ZEs and stuff like that. They all have their own unique challenges. When we're just watching that space to see what will be the most effective way for it to land on farm for us at this stage.
Right, thanks, Jo. And you've got another one. You're popular, and it's a really good question. I know you've done work on it. What has this cost our farm to target emissions and implement it on farm?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of our, we have a wagon wheel approach to balancing our progress across all aspects of our farm business. And sometimes there's a conflict between the environmental outcomes, which of course our greenhouse gas sits in, and our business health. So what we were noticing, it was getting harder and harder for us to achieve a certain cost of production. And our aim is to be in the top 20% for operating profit. So there's always been this real tension and conflict around progressing in one area and trying to extract value from it while we maintain business health. We did quite a bit of work on understanding where our expenses are being loaded into our farm business, and we've got this approach which we call our staircase of expenses and income. And what we looked at is where what our business as usual cost was. And when we looked forward, when we were doing our budgeting for the 22-23 year, we could see that our business as usual cost of production, so that's farm working expenses per kilo milk solid, was around about $4.73. Now, when we started to look at the rise in input costs, which of course is another thing that's happening in our current environment at the moment, that was looking to add about another 35 cents. And then when we started to look at our increasing standards, which is meeting what our customers expect of us just to remain in the market, and also future-proofing, which is about getting our business ready to tackle the challenges going forward, that was adding about another 64 cents or so. So that's another 6 to 13% cost on top of our business as usual, which is a compliant, productive business system. Now, the big thing for us is how do we extract value out of that? So while we're continuing to absorb costs into our business, we need to look at where do we extract value from it. So for us, we look at how do we access reduced lending rates if we've got a more resilient business, and that's part of what we're able to do with the Sustainable Agricultural Finance Initiative. We try and extract premiums for our milk, so making sure we're getting the highest value for any kilo milk solid that we're producing, and also extracting value from high quality stock. So looking at high BW cows and how we can extract more value out of that. So as we kind of limber up for the future, we try and allocate lines in our budget. So we also have lines in our budget for our costs of emissions, and also any potential carbon credits we can have. And so that just highlights to us every year the cost of doing nothing.
Yeah, it's a great graph, that one as well, to have that demonstrated to all of your staff. Might throw to Anita. Anita, why is New Zealand leading the charge into pricing emissions when we're amongst the most efficient producers currently in the world?
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, we have been the most efficient, but I think other countries are hot on our heels, so we can't be too complacent about maintaining that position. But I think it's partly because we are leaders in this space that the rest of the world are looking to what we do, and we need to demonstrate leadership partly, and show practical ways to achieve these emission reductions in a sector that is 50% of our emissions. I mean, you know, I think hopefully we all agree that agriculture, we need to do something about reducing emissions in this sector. I think we also need to, if we don't, how can we expect other countries to reduce their emissions? And I think we've got a really important role to play in demonstrating practical ways to do this. And I guess I just come back to the point about impacts and what that's going to mean for our production. Every degree or part of a degree that we can avoid of warming, which is global efforts to reduce emissions, will have important effects on how those impacts, how intense those impacts are, how often we have droughts and things like that. So I just feel we do need to be part of the global solution and demonstrate how we can do it.
And Anita, you may remember this factoid I've heard you articulate before, as if you combined all of the countries of similar size to New Zealand, what that equaled. Can you recall that one?
Yeah, well, that's putting me on the spot. I can't actually remember it exactly, but all the countries that are less than 1% do add up to about 30% of global emissions or something like that. Don't quote exactly, but I mean, there are a lot of other countries in our position who are also trying very hard to reduce their emissions across different sectors.
Great. Thanks, Anita. One for Phil. So, Phil, it sounds possible to lower emissions and maintain profitability if assuming farm managers are capable of doing so. How many are truly this capable? And the add-on I would probably add is, how do we upskill them if they're not capable today?
It's a tricky one. Well, in the sense, I mean, if you look at farmer ability, there's a bell curve, obviously, which applies to any and every profession and trade out there. So we're not necessarily picking on farmers per se. I would say certainly the top 20% of farmers would be able to readily implement the sort of stuff that our farm is doing. I think the vast majority would be able to with good advice and support. And I think I'd have to say at this point in time that's very limited out there. And one of the things we've been pushing for is particularly through He Waka Kanoa and/or government, there needs to be an extension program to promote this information and provide the support to farmers. And I would argue it is very badly needed. And at this point in time, I hate to say it, there's not a lot on the horizon.
Yeah, I think we'd agree. It's we want to support the industry and make that great intel available. Joe, I think, not sure who said this, Joe, but with the reduction in stock numbers, what was the impact on milk solids produced?
So what we saw with the reduced stocking rate is higher per cow production. So that's coupled with the changes that we've done in feed on farm and BW. What we've seen with the per hectare production is that it tends to stick around that 1,000 to 1,200, and that tends to be mainly driven by the climate that we're still experiencing. So as a system 2 farm being pasture dominant, we're still a little bit at the mercy around how much feed we grow each year, and that's why we still continue to get that sort of variability in our per hectare production. So you tend to find the per hectare sort of stays the same, but what you're looking for is that reduced stocking rate has to be more efficient on a per cow production level. And that's the trade-off. That was what Phil was talking about, is trying to maintain the profitability and the production of your system by using that feed. Instead of maintaining more cows, you're using that to do more milk production with the cows that you have got within your system context as well, and feed availability.
Yep. Thank you, Joe. Now, this is anyone who wants to answer. What is the view of alternative factors, e.g. composting barns, dung beetles, and changing how we farm to reduce emissions and reliance on artificial inputs?
Oh, well, I'm happy to comment. I mean, they all have a role. They will all have some impact to some degree, and it will vary considerably, between the farms and the way the farm's being managed. In terms of dung beetles, I'm not sure there's been a lot of research done in terms of what their impact on greenhouse gas emissions are. Composting barns is certainly work showing that it does reduce your nitrous oxide emissions and things like that. Sorry, was it around outside inputs or reducing outside inputs, or
to reduce emissions or reduce the reliance on artificial inputs?
Well, short answer is if you reduce your artificial inputs, which presumably, I mean, is meant to be supplements and nitrogen. Again, as I mentioned earlier, that will certainly reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. It will impact on your farm profitability. I mean, at the end of the day, guys, you should only be using nitrogen fertilizer and or supplements if there's a marginal profit in doing so. And I'm not too sure how many farmers actually work that one out. But yeah, I think our farming systems will evolve. Certainly, becoming more efficient overall certainly adds. Maintaining pasture quality, all that sort of thing. So I think over the next few years, the next few decades, we will evolve. Now, if I might jump ahead, Tim, to 50 years, I mean, under current trends, in 50 years, New Zealand will no longer be a temperate country. We'll be sort of semi-subtropical. So you're looking at warm, wet winters, hot, dry summers. Now, our current systems won't survive that. The current breeds that we've got can't stand the temperatures. So will we be milking cows? Yes, but they'll be Bos Indicus, Zebus, Sahiwals. They won't be Friesians or Jerseys. Our C3 pastures won't be growing because it's too hot for them. I mean, ryegrass bites the dust at 25 degrees. So we'll be grazing C4 pastures. As an example, Kaiku and Paspalum. Now, they're probably not good examples because they're very poor quality. But part of the issue there is we actually perhaps need to look at plant breeding. So in 50 years' time, we do have high-quality C4 type pastures. So without getting too carried away, I mean, yes, we certainly do have a future, but things will change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that comes back to the great point made earlier that we need to think about what we can do now in terms of adaptations and what we'll need to do in the decades to come as that climate continues to change. But guys, we've ticked over our 45 minutes, so we'll pull things to a close there. But many thanks to our audience for your questions, and thanks to the panelists for your very considered answers. I absolutely know that the panel and I are passionate about seeing the agriculture sector thrive for centuries to come, and these conversations are really important to support action that makes our businesses more resilient and ready to take on the opportunities that come from change. So thank you for your attendance. A recording of this webinar will be shared along with links to some of the useful resources discussed. And finally, we would really appreciate your feedback. And there is a small pop-up to the right of your screen with a couple of short survey questions. So please take a minute to answer these and also share any thoughts on what topics you'd like us to cover in the future. So once again, thank you, and look to seeing you on this webinar format sometime in the future. Thanks, everybody.